Mr. Lawton, this is Don.
Yeah. Hi, Don. Can you hear me?
Yeah, and I wanted to see if we could get started setting things up.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's why I popped in here a little early.
Yeah, good. Thanks. I don't see Cathy yet.
No, and I know she was just presenting, or in the first session she was presenting.
Oh, okay, so she's taking a break.
I'm not sure. I imagine she'll be along shortly, but she had a little bit more to keep track of than I did. So let me just see if I can present.
Are you going to be the one who's
Yeah, I'll have the slides and we can share. I've got a dual monitor set up, but I'm happy to share one of those.
Do you know how to do that?
I do, I think.
Okay. Let's go ahead and get that set up, and it can sit on the, the presentation title slide.
Right. I'm not sure that I am a presenter yet.
Well, you don't have to be a presenter. You just have to see the green button at the bottom. If you put your cursor down to the bottom of your Zoom window.
Oh, there's the share. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And then you select which window you want
Perfect.
to actually share. Perfect.
All right. And that actually shouldn't be the right one. 1 second. What we want to do, that's okay. With all of us going home, there we go. Share that one. And now you should see sort of a background there and other WRLC slides. Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I know we had some lag in one of the previous sessions, so are you seeing slide transitions a little bit?
I am.
Okay, perfect.
And how do I pronounce your first name?
Oh, it's Topher, like Christopher.
Okay.
It's short for Christopher.
Okay, as opposed to Chris.
Indeed, there were many Chris's in my group of friends growing up. So.
Uh-huh. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third session of our first online WRLC annual meeting. I want to thank the presenters that agreed to go online to share their ideas and insights with the WRLC community, and also thanks to all of you who have joined us online today. I'm Don Gourley, the Director of Information Technology at WRLC, and I will be moderating this session on getting started with library privacy practices for library personnel. And it's going to be presented by Topher Lawton, the Instructional Technology and Assessment Librarian at Georgetown University, and Cathy Meals, Assessment Librarian at the University of the District of Columbia. Our session is going to last 45 minutes, and our presenters will explain how they will conduct the interaction and brainstorming in the session. Please watch the Zoom group chat for links and instructions and requests from the presenters. And with that, I'll hand it over to our presenters and we can get started.
All right. Thank you very much, Don. And yeah, as Don was mentioning, please do keep an eye on the chat. We have a couple of links in there, and let us know if you can't see the links that we've posted if you've come in a little bit late or anything like that. Both a new folder, this is a Google folder of a number of materials that we have, as well as a document link, that sort of docs.google.com link, which brings you to the brainstorming notes document there. So Cathy and I have spent some time in the last week or so flipping things rapidly into an online format, and we're so glad that you could join us. But please do bear with us as we had planned for a fairly interactive session, and hopefully we can take many of those exercises online, but just in case we have a hard time with that or any other pitfalls, do let us know. We'll be monitoring the chat fairly carefully. And then also leave some time at the questions, or leave some time for questions throughout the session and towards the end. And thanks again, Cathy, for posting the link there. So our two initial questions as we get started. Oh, and let me make sure, here we go. So hi, everyone. Welcome to this session on library privacy and getting started with library privacy as we sort of go on there. So we had two brainstorming questions that we wanted to ask people to think about as we got in, and certainly do feel free to share your thoughts in the brainstorming notes. But one of the big ones is, we were going to ask, well, why are people in the room? What questions do you have about library privacy? If you have specific privacy concerns, what are the big ones? What's getting there? What are your big concerns here? So for example, I see a privacy concern posted in the anonymous brainstorming notes about the data we don't know we're collecting in libapps. Are there things that we're gathering that maybe we shouldn't gather, maybe we at least should be aware that we're gathering, and can we change those levels? That's a great question. Other questions that certainly my colleagues at Georgetown have asked are things like, well, isn't there some way that we can collect information? Do we have a duty to gather information for assessment purposes? How do we navigate the privacy pitfalls there? And certainly we can work a lot of those angles as we're leading the session, as we're talking about that. And we'll keep checking back in on these two questions in the brainstorming notes document. So if you have other thoughts about, questions for library privacy, feel free to stick them in chat, feel free to stick them in the notes document there, and we'll keep revisiting. But to give everyone just a sense of what we're going to work on today, the plan really is to take a little bit more of a personal look. And we are going to talk about things from a library standpoint as well. But we want to talk about one framework for evaluating risks to privacy. So ways that you can kind of assess the privacy needs that you might have in your community, and figuring out ways that you can mitigate those risks. And then thinking about concrete steps that you can take to improve privacy for you and at your library. And this will be some brainstorming together, as we've talked about a little bit. Really thinking about applying those best practices and some of the habits that we're going to talk about, and hopefully talk to each other about, as we get going. I hope you do share your own ideas as we're thinking about the best practices and habits in our work and lives for privacy, web privacy, data security. Lots of these concepts all kind of overlap, and so we'll get things there. One of the things that we really do want to cover as well, in sort of the initial housekeeping here, is that our approach, this workshop is the start of a conversation, really. It's definitely not the final word on the subject of privacy. We're taking kind of a crash course idea. So it's this idea of harm reduction, that there is always a learning curve with privacy with any new topic, but the actions that we can take at any point will strengthen different privacy protections for users that we can offer in our libraries. So, Cathy and I believe that all people deserve digital security, privacy, control over their data, and so on. But also, everyone is learning. Everybody starts somewhere. There really shouldn't be any stigma for folks who want to improve. Whether you've come with zero privacy training or knowledge or actions taken to improve privacy, or lots of them. Everyone is still learning. Everyone is an expert in their own individual context, and that we can increase privacy practices for individuals and for libraries, but that's going to be a process. So together we can all improve. We can add additional digital safety protections for ourselves, for our libraries, and for our communities. So that's kind of where we're at. Cathy, have I missed anything there?
I will say I have a cold. For those of you who are listening who weren't on my previous session, I may or may not be starting to lose my voice, so I probably don't have too much to add right now. I might end up just contributing in the chat a little bit, but keep checking in with me, Topher.
Will do. All right, thanks. All right, well, so then, of course, I'll again invite folks to use the chat if you have any questions, and we'll keep monitoring that throughout. But let's go ahead and dive right in and think about privacy in libraries. And so we wanted to start here because really there's not that much to say. Libraries protect privacy by default. The specifics of how we do that or how much privacy we're supposed to be protecting, those are sort of political conversations that we can fight out later. And I'm certainly very happy to do that. But in terms of overall general guidance, we have very clear direction from the American Library Association, both from the user standpoint and our own professional code of ethics. So I usually would hesitate to put this many words on a slide, and certainly wouldn't read it. But in this case, I do think it's fairly important. So For the Library Bill of Rights, Section 7 states that all people, regardless of origin, age, background, or views, and so again, all people here, possess a right to privacy and confidentiality in their library use. Libraries should advocate for, educate about, and protect people's privacy, safeguarding all library use data, including personally identifiable information. And we won't delve too much into the nitty-gritty of what types of information we might be protecting, but I will call out there, that specific wording, personally identifiable information, or PII, is one of the key phrases that you'll want to keep in mind as you're thinking about privacy. And thinking about and talking about privacy policies and things like that. There's often a line drawn between the sort of personally identifiable information, so the things that we can point back and say, oh, that's Bob's, or oh, that's Susie's information here. We don't want to do that necessarily, but in other cases, there's more what can be called directory information often, that some information is going to be public. Some information is going to be considered less harmful, something that we can share out a little bit more. And so the PII, their personally identifiable information, is one I wanted to call specific attention to. And that statement, though, is coming from the Bill of Rights. So this is what ALA, at least, is saying that libraries offer to the public. That we believe as an organization, I shouldn't say we in terms of ALA. ALA believes as an organization, and the many librarians who are members of ALA have sort of put forth this Bill of Rights, talking about the importance for privacy protections. Similarly, on our end, Section 3 of the Code of Ethics, again from ALA, talks about how we protect each library user's right to privacy and confidentiality with respect to information sought or received, resources consulted, borrowed, acquired, or transmitted. And so this is a part of the Code of Ethics that says we're not going to talk about it. If you're a researcher, we hold dear your right to confidentiality there. It is a professional value of ours, an ethic of ours, to make sure that we're protecting that. And I will say, I picked the two ALA examples as I think fairly well said and broadly applicable, but many, many other organizations have codes of ethics or similar sort of rights statements that touch on privacy and confidentiality, particularly in research and information freedom ideas, sort of that intellectual freedom. You can research anything you want, and we're going to make sure that people aren't going to judge you for it. And that's true in archives, that's true in special libraries, that's certainly true in ALA, and there's lots of other examples there.
And I would just add too that your own institutions might have your own privacy policies. We don't have like a comprehensive list, I don't think, of what institutions here do and do not. I know we at UDC do not yet. I hope that will change in the future, but that would be, complementary documents to these ALA documents.
Right. Yeah, and that's certainly true. And some of the resources that we'll talk about as we move through the presentation today will focus on sort of how do you write a privacy policy for your library? How would you gather that? We had begun the process at Georgetown last summer, and we got through a lot of the sort of preliminary research and came up with sort of a vision document that I think was something worth sharing if people are curious about the way we started to approach it, and conversations are ongoing in terms of turning that vision into a privacy policy that we can all get behind. But yeah, I think different institutions handle information differently, but thinking about libraries as in need of privacy policies and really being able to say, well, here's what we're going to do to protect your privacy, and here's how we're going to do that. But I think one of the first things, and I'll use that as the segue there, one of the first things that we need to do if we're talking about protecting privacy is to know what we're protecting it from. So I'm going to take just a quick couple of minutes to think about the ways that we can assess your risks. And this is sometimes called threat modeling, which is, it sounds very militaristic, threat modeling, but it's actually pulled from cybersecurity. So one of the quotes I really like about this is that threat modeling is a way of narrowly thinking about the sorts of protection you want for your data. It's, ideally, it's impossible to protect against every kind of trick or every attacker, so you should concentrate on which people might want your data, what they might want from it, and how they might get it. And so that's a quote from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, or EFF. You'll see their resources a lot throughout the rest of the presentation. They've been doing work in the cybersecurity and privacy sphere for a couple of decades now, and are highly recommended as folks to talk with. But basically, you know, in a nutshell, it's really hard to protect against everything possible. If we say, oh my goodness, we have to save everything, that's probably not going to work. And so what we want to do is think very carefully and deliberately, and then prioritize. And threat modeling is a framework that helps us do that a little bit more. And so when we think about threat modeling, there's basically 5 major questions. What do I want to protect? Who do I want to protect it from? How bad are the consequences if I fail? How likely is it I'll need to protect it? And then finally, how much trouble am I willing to go through to try and prevent those consequences? And as we ask ourselves each of these 5 questions, of course, we have some extra vocabulary there. And one of the reasons that I wanted to really talk about this is that we can use this vocabulary to talk with non-library professionals to consult with this, you know, whether that's campus IT folks, you know, if we talk about data assets, you know, that's really just the stuff we want to protect. You can talk about adversaries with a cybersecurity expert, and they'll know what that means, you know, the bad actors that we're trying to protect our data from. Similarly, potential threats are threats to the organization or to the individual if that protection is breached. So if your data is compromised, if your security is compromised, what could happen there? You know, let's think our way through those potential threats, and then thinking through the adversary's capabilities as well, which is how likely is it that I will need to protect it? So, you know, one of the things that we talk a lot about is, you know, if you have your laptop double locked down in all sorts of ways, you know, that might stop the hacker from across the country getting at you, you know, the digital one, but that will work with the digital capabilities of your adversaries. However, if somebody comes and walks away with your laptop when you've left it out at a cafe somewhere, that's a very different capability. That's a very different threat that we're going to need to worry about, or to think about at least, in terms of how likely is it that I'll need to protect it. You know, similarly, it's much likelier that I will need to protect my work computer from digital threats than from somebody coming in and walking off with an older desktop, you know, things like that. And then, you know, similarly, or finally, the appetite for risk is thinking about, you know, well, how much trouble am I willing to go through? You know, do I want to take a physical, like, bike lock kind of cable and lock my laptop down anytime I've put it somewhere? No, probably not. But do I want to do that anytime that I might walk away from it for a while? Probably. In fact, I might not walk away from it for a while. And yes, it's extra trouble to pack it all up before, you know, I run down for a cup of coffee in the cafe. But it's probably trouble that is worthwhile to take. And so let's take a minute and think through this. In our shared folder, we have, and I will open it up and put it on the shared screen, the EFF Threat Modeling Activity handout, which is a great handout there in terms of how, and here we go. Oh, nope, that's not the folder that I wanted. That's just an extra copy of the slides. But we can get that threat modeling handout. And I want to just sort of walk through in a digital sphere.
I just dropped the link into the chat.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much. And I'll grab it for the screen share as well. All right. So activity handout, here we go. So hopefully you can all see this now. It's sort of a bright pink threat modeling handout, and I will zoom out a little bit because that is awfully big. And so again, this is part of the surveillance self-defense toolkit from EFF. So again, that Electronic Frontier Foundation are some of the best resources in this sphere, and I strongly encourage all of you to work on that. But this is thinking about sort of the jewel thief example. You know, if you have a jewelry store, who are you working on? And as we step through, you know, what assets are you protecting? Well, it's the diamonds or the money in the safe you have, or anything like that. And we can think about each one of these as we move through these exercises. So I see it's 4:02 right now. What I'd like you to do for your own library, for your own for your own self, if you'd like. If you want to think about personal data security, you're welcome to do that now. What I'd like to do is just take a brief moment and think about each one of these questions. So you can take notes here. You can take notes in our brainstorming notes document. Let me add a section. We have next steps, but I'll call it threat modeling. And these are, what assets would you want to protect as a library? And let's take maybe 2 minutes to think about that.
It might also be helpful as you're thinking through some of the assets and things that you're protecting is, there's some stuff that easily comes to mind, like circulation records and things like that, that we might automatically be purging. But what other information is that we are either explicitly or, inadvertently or unintentionally or however collecting about our users? Are things ending up in your reference transactions? How do you handle study room checkouts? Think about some of those things like that might not be, the kind of common stuff.
Right. And I think similarly to that, Cathy, that's a really excellent point in terms of the not quite so common stuff that we're protecting, the assets that we're protecting. But also in terms of adversaries, I also think about some otherwise very much on the same team people. Who are your adversaries? Well, sometimes your adversaries might be coworkers. Sometimes an adversary might be the provost of the university. If a high-level university administrator comes and says, tell me, who is coming into your library? What questions are they asking? Are you prepared to protect the data in that way? A question there. And so, yeah, and I see some other folks typing in the brainstorming notes document, which is really, really great.
Yeah, these are good. I like the library staff training one with the training specifically perhaps focused on this stuff.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and I will say, I'm sure many of us have done it, although I certainly try not to have these conversations anymore. But I've had conversations with colleagues about, well, can you believe so-and-so is the one who checked out X, Y, or Z material? Can you believe, they don't look like they're the type, whatever that might be, whether that's a sort of stodgy professor checking out a book on floral crochet or, other way around, the very unassuming older woman with a motorcycle fancier's book. That's none of our business. But in the same time, those could be considered privacy breaches, and particularly thinking about the identifiable part of PII, it's one thing to know who was checking something out without knowing what it was, and a very different thing to know what was checked out without knowing who did it. But when you can connect what was checked out to who did the checking out, that can be a bit more of a challenge.
One thing that comes to mind too is, Topher, can I talk a little bit about the inspiration for this session?
Please.
So one of the reasons that we wanted to do this session, Topher and I were both at the Southeastern Library Assessment Conference in November. I can see some other folks who are here were also there. And there was a session about, gosh, I even forget exactly what it was they were trying to do. I think it was trying to track library usage and prove to certain academic departments that, yes, your students do so use the library. We are important. And one of the means that they were doing that was through collecting easy proxy data when students logged in to use resources. So they essentially had access to what people were using when they were logging in and so forth. They were tracking like swipes to get into the building and doing this kind of very blithely that I think was unsettling to a lot of people in the room. And so, you know, we were realizing that even though these are kind of core principles of our profession, not everybody is always quite on the same page. And then that's why I see in the adversaries, I think there's some interesting answers, you know, other campus partners, an intern, myself, right? These are kind of everywhere, both, you know, because maybe we have a lapse ourselves, or other people might not be, you know, as committed or as aware of the principles as we are too.
Right. All right, so I see some really great answers in the threat modeling section there, and I encourage you to keep working there. We're going to take just about 2 more minutes because in the interest of time, we do want to leave plenty of room there.
I just want to call out the consequences. Obviously, you know, somebody said FERPA violations, but in addition to that, hang on, I just lost my thing. Trust in your library, right? You know, we're a trusted information source for so many people, both for, you know, academic purposes, but even sometimes for other stuff as well. And so that actually is an impact that we might not think of right away, but that could be even more, you know, meaningful in some respects in terms of the consequences.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is a little bit of a tangent, but one that I think is perhaps worthwhile to go on. There's a lot of discussion in particularly the sort of undergrad library instruction discussions that I've been in about how much of a risk some research can be for the researcher. You know, people, particularly new researchers, undergrad students, or folks who don't have a lot of experience, may well come in with a burning question that they have that for whatever reason they perceive some societal pressure not to ask it. And if they get embarrassed because their research topic gets out, you know, the thing that they're really curious about gets out, they may not ask that question again. I mean, so then not only would they lose trust in the library, but some really good researchers may lose trust in themselves too. You know, and say, oh, I guess I'm not really the person to ask that. And I think particularly, I mean, if we are thinking about perhaps more vulnerable populations, you know, first generation college students, really anybody who isn't ready to sort of challenge the world on their research topic, we really do have a responsibility to make sure that we're handling that data sensitively, you know, in a good way.
One thing I'm noticing too is that we have comments or ideas under all of the questions except for how likely are these consequences, which is interesting, right? We don't always know, which I think is all the better reason, you know, have a session like this and to be prepared and be thinking about these things proactively.
Yeah, no, and I think that's actually one of the harder ones too. And I'll turn your attention back to the screen share. Let's see if I can rotate clockwise. Here we go. I really like that this is again sort of the jewel thief metaphor, but they've mapped out some of the likelihood there in terms of how likelihood is it going to happen and how bad will it be when it happens. So the risk and threat matrix there. And I don't know, you know, we've put a big old question mark on the how likely are these consequences here. But in terms of looking at what are the consequences, I think we have a lot of different ranges. I mean, the consequences for violating FERPA, if you get caught and fined by the federal government, are pretty high. You know, the consequences in terms of trust in your library or chilling effects on research, those could be both much stronger or maybe not so strong. You know, that they could be threats that people would eventually get over in a different institution or in a different research question. But it's hard to know there. And so, you know, of course, as with any sort of Cartesian coordinate plane like this, you're hoping to keep both low consequences, but especially low likelihood. And especially when it gets higher and higher consequence towards threat, you want to keep things down here. But I mean, this is a good one. This is, again, thinking about the jewel thief, but similarly in libraries, you know, the employee misplaces their key here. You know, do you have people sharing logins for Alma here? You know, there's a lot of data in Alma that could be problematic. And are you sure that you have control over everybody who uses it? You know, and so it can be uncomfortable, I think, and it's important to recognize that. You don't necessarily want to be paranoid, but to really think through things deliberately and thinking about how, to some degree, everybody's a threat. You know, even perfectly innocent folks who would never willingly wreck something, they can lose their keys. You know, it happens to all of us. We're all human here. And so, yeah.
So
I guess
we're running up around 4:15, Topher. I'm wondering if we should move on to some of the tools in
I
the.
think so. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's an excellent point because we are a little bit short on time. And Don, you can confirm it's 4:30 that we're ending, right? So we want to.
Yes, 4:30.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, so we will be sure to get out of here by then. So yeah, so we wanted to take just a couple of quick minutes to think about some privacy tools. Of course, one of the sort of universal things if you're looking at digital security is thinking about passwords. And there's a couple of different ways that you can make them strong. I really like the punchline here of the XKCD comic that I've listed, which is, you know, through 20 years of effort, we've trained everyone to use passwords that are hard to remember but easy for computers to guess. And so one of the current ways of thinking about passwords is that you just need to make them longer. You know, if you need to add an additional character in terms of, you know, like a special character or a number or something like that, that's fine. You know, listen to your campus IT, you know, as they're thinking about what makes a strong password. But the longer your password is, the better. And most password managers or most password entities are going to say, well, it has to be at least 8 characters. But, you know, 8 characters is fine. 16 is better. 30 is even better than that. And one of the best ways that you can think about passwords and, you know, not reusing the passwords from one site to another is to consider a password manager. So at Georgetown, we have LastPass, which I strongly recommend to anybody, certainly if you have an institutional setup, but even if you don't, there are good free versions. It works beautifully in my experience. And, you know, to me, the risks of not using a password manager were much higher than the risks of having a password manager and then having that be compromised. That said, you know, as a live example of threat modeling, I don't have my banking information in my password manager. I think it is more likely that someday some hacker would try and get into the password manager than they would, you know, steal my very long randomly generated password that is hidden on a physical piece of paper somewhere I'm not going to tell you about, you know, and that's just, again, the trade-off there. But password managers are pretty great. They allow you to remember one complicated password and then have randomly generated passwords for everything else. There's lots of options out there. I'm happy to talk with folks about that after the session. Then in terms of library-specific tools, we wanted to call your attention to 3 things here. The privacy toolkit, which again looks, as we've done, at some library core values, and then particularly at tools for creating that privacy policy, as well as what to do once you have one. You know, how do you bring stakeholders on board for privacy? How do you get folks there? And then the guidelines and checklists take, for each one of these different types of topic areas, I guess you can call it, ways that you can improve privacy. And one of the things I really like about the guidelines is that they break things up into tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, kind of the basic protections that everybody should have, or very sort of site-specific, context-specific, complicated guidelines. And they do that for all sorts of things. So of course, you know, the topics here are data exchange in lots of ways, assistive technology, vendors of all sorts. So, you know, what should you be looking for when you're working with your digital vendors? Thinking about library management systems and OPACs and ILSs and all of those sorts of fun things, as well as you know, this may be less applicable in our context, but they have good checklists for libraries in K through 12 schools. So these are all available from ALA, definitely worth giving a quick look. And one of the things that I'll say about these too is that it's useful to look at these and use these just to get some of the vocabulary, even if you aren't necessarily the person who's actually going through the checklist and checking things off. you can become a little bit more conversant by reading through some of these privacy checklists and guidelines. And then finally, yeah, with a little over 10 minutes to go, we wanted to spend some time thinking about some next steps for you, your library, and your institution. So I'll ask you to go, first we're going to take just a couple of minutes, and in the interest of time, let's adjust. We'll do 1 minute individual, and then we'll do 5 minutes together. And the first thing to do is we do have a worksheet in our folder, but I've also included it at the bottom part of our brainstorming notes document. And you'll see many of these, let me pull that over.
I just threw the link into the chat as well.
Thanks, Kathy. Many of these little blocks that say, okay, well, what's a possible action? Why does it matter? What's the action scope and what's the influence needed there? And if you see the worksheet that Kathy put together is a Word document in our shared folder, and it's beautifully formatted. But in terms of thinking about the action scope, we've sort of encourage you to think about, well, is it individual, me? Is it organizational, my library? Or is it fully, my institution? What can we do there? And then thinking about the influence needed, similarly, it's, I can do this myself, I can influence this, or I need buy-in from other people. I can really work in on this. And so those two are important to think about. Certainly the first three, so the action and the rationale, why is this important, as well as the scope would be great to fill out. So let's take 1 minute and brainstorm, and I'll watch the time. And then feel free to hop into our brainstorming notes document and start typing away.
What we were thinking, if we were doing this face-to-face, is that we could individually do this, and then you could move with somebody from your institution and share, especially on those kind of like library level ideas. So, even though we're moving into a world of virtual meetings, I still think it could be very powerful to take your ideas and debrief them with a colleague.
All right, we've got about 15 more seconds in our brainstorming minute. All right. And so, yeah, I hope as you've brainstormed for yourself, you've come up with some great ideas, and we'd love to see them in the brainstorming notes there. So, and again, feel free to take your own private notes, but also, yeah, to tuck things in the brainstorming notes when you have a chance. So one of the possible actions would be to create a library privacy policy. It matters because the privacy policy would then guide further action or training in the library. But that's a library-wide scope, and you would certainly need buy-in from administrators and many others.
Do we want to move into questions?
Yeah, I think that certainly might be a good idea.
All right, well, let's
I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
okay.
And again, that shared folder will be available for anybody, and we'll make sure that it's up on the sort of proceedings from the annual meeting. There.
If you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat.
Somehow it's far worse in a dead air situation on a web meeting to have no silent, total silence than it is in a classroom.
I know we can't stare at you until you ask a question.
Yes.
Just imagine us virtually staring at you.
Yes.
Well, I can fill up some dead air with just saying that we are recording, and the recording will be available to you on that web page on the library staff intranet where we had the links to the Zoom meetings. That'll be replaced with a link to the recording. And I imagine Topher and Cathy will leave the resources on the Google Drive, the Google folder, available for you all to look at, and as was suggested, maybe share with some of your colleagues.
We certainly will.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I don't want to speak for Cathy, but I'm certainly happy to talk with other people about privacy issues. And Cathy, I assume you are too?
Of course.
Yeah. One thing I'll also just tuck into the chat, I've mentioned this a couple of times, but the Surveillance Self-Defense Kit from EFF is a really great set of online trainings for personal security, particularly for online communication work. And there is a sort of connected teaching, what do they call it? The Security Education Companion, which is a set of teachers' guides for people who are leading workshops. And I will say, they recommend at least 90 minutes for a privacy workshop. So if you're feeling like we moved really quickly and this was sort of overwhelming, it's because even condensing things and trying to abridge things for 45 minutes is a tricky task. So again, this is the start of a conversation, by no means the end of one. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the Library Freedom Project, which is another great resource for particularly library freedom, or library privacy rather, and they're working on a lot. They're just libraryfreedom.org. Again, I'll stick the link in chat. And so they're a little bit more library focused compared to EFF, who is working with everybody. And so they are, Library Freedom is attempting to, both train library practitioners and provide a bunch of resources for folks who are trying to do more for privacy advocacy. And finally, tucked in the Zoom chat, I'll put my email address as well as Cathy's. Again, feel free to reach out to either one of us to chat about privacy in libraries or anything else that you were curious about or had questions about this time. So we're all in this together.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Topher and Cathy. And I'm going to leave. We have 3 minutes left if anybody thinks of a last minute question, and I'll also leave the meeting open just to make sure you can get any links that you want from the chat. I'm not sure how that carries over to a recording, if at all.
Actually, I believe it does carry over, and in some cases, and I'm not sure about the recording, but I believe the private chats also may have. So if anybody said rather than the to everyone chat, if you had a chat specifically with one person or another, I believe those also get captured in the recording, which is an interesting thing from a privacy standpoint.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think it's the end of the day. Maybe people are tired of web meetings.
Yeah. Tired of being cooped up.
Yep.
Well, thanks again, you two, and everybody for participating.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.